Hey guys, so today I'm going to give you some techniques how to evangelize your spouses and loved ones. But first I just want to say I'm really excited about what I'm seeing in our priesthood. I know there's a focus on a lot of these older priests that have done really horrible things, but I'm seeing a young group of priests coming up. You know, we just interviewed Father Jeremiah Hahn. He's like 30 years old, on fire for the Lord. Before that we interviewed Father Grodi, another, I think 30, 31 years old maybe, on fire for the Lord. My priest is 30 years old, on fire for the Lord. And then yesterday we had a deacon in his last year of seminary, and he's from Vietnam, and we had him the whole month of June, and his homilies were on fire. And you know, you're definitely not listening to an Oprah Winfrey motivational speech. You're listening to a man of God giving you the truth of the gospel. And he's going to be a priest within a year, Lord willing. And this is a group, and they're all around 30. And you know, Jesus started his ministry at 32 years old. And I think God is doing something in the Catholic Church, bringing us these godly priests that love the Lord, and they're young enough to grow in the faith, and one day be our bishops and our leaders. And maybe one of these guys that we see are going to be Pope one day. You know, all things are possible with God. But I believe for years he's been pruning his church, you know, taking the bad branches and throwing them into the fire. And now this tree, this Catholic faith is getting stronger. And I'm really excited. And I told the Vietnamese deacon yesterday I'm going to steal his story he told at the beginning of his homily. So I'm going to keep my promise. You know, the late Herman Cain used to say, you know, when I quote somebody, the first time I quote him, I give the name of the person I'm quoting. The second time I say, this is something I've heard. The third time I own it. So this is the first time. So I forget the deacon's name. Forgive me, but he's going to become a priest in the Orlando diocese, and I'm really excited. This guy's on fire. He's going to be an awesome priest. And the story he gave was, real quickly, 3 men died and went to heaven. St. Peter asked the first man, were you faithful to your wife? The man confessed that he cheated on her twice. St. Peter said, well, all I can give you is a compact car to drive around heaven then. He asked the second man the same question. And the second man said, I was unfaithful to her once. He said, well, I can give you a mid-sized car. The third man, he asked, said, no, I was faithful to my wife to the end. St. Peter said, well, you get a luxury car. You get the nicest car in heaven to drive around heaven. The next day, the 2 guys with the mid-sized car and the compact car seen the guy in his luxury car crying hysterically on his steering wheel. And they said, what do you have to cry about? You get to drive this luxury car. He said, I just passed my wife and she was riding a skateboard. So his point of the story was Christ is calling us to be faithful. And to be faithful to Christ, like Christ was faithful to the Father when he was on earth. And the way we live that out on this earth is by being faithful to one another, especially if you're a married Christian, to be faithful to Christ. If you're a single Christian, to be chaste and faithful to Christ. A married Christian, rather, be faithful to his wife or his husband, is an example living out our faith with Christ. But I'm going to get specifically, I'm going to give you like the best evangelist and apologist that I know on these subjects. I'm going to quote them. And we're going to talk about husbands, wives, and children. But what about other loved ones? Well, Jesus said, love your neighbor as yourself. And Jesus goes on to tell us the whole world is our neighbor. So how do we love our neighbor? Well, first we love them. First we love them. If you're trying to win them over and you're angry and you're arguing, that's not love. Everything, you know, we have to share the truth and love. So we're loving them because we care about their soul. Hell is real. We want to see these people go to hell. And life is hard. And we don't want to see these people suffering without God comforting them. We all suffer. The difference between Christians is we have the peace of God. Even if our circumstances are a mess, we still have the peace. And the way we get that peace is by abiding in Christ. And Jesus said, if you eat my flesh and drink my blood, I will abide in you and you will abide in me. John 6:56. So make sure you go into Mass consistently and eating the Eucharist. So, but in practical terms, you know, you got to be ready. St. Peter said, always be ready to give a defense. of the faith that lies within you. So the word apologetics is apologist. It's just a Greek word for apology. Saint Justin Martyr was considered a Christian apologist in the 2nd century. It's a Greek word. It's just knowing arguments to defend the faith. We need to learn arguments. And evangelization is just converting people to Christianity. And we're called to the old evangelization, which was converting unbelievers, pagans and atheists, and the new evangelization, bringing baptized Catholics back home to the church. So we'll start with the old evangelization. The questions I always get, and again, I'm no theologian, no apologist. I'm just blue-collar Catholic. This is real. But I've been in the field. I've been witnessing to people for 36 years, why Christ is real and why God is real. So I'm just giving you techniques that I've used and that I think work. But nothing always works. Some things work, some things don't. But questions I get all the time is, how could God be real? There's no proof of God. I'm like, how could you not believe in God? It's just common sense. If you see a design, there's always a designer. You don't assume Microsoft Word just happened randomly, okay? You assume there was a programmer. Our genetic code has 3 billion letters, much more complicated than anything Microsoft has programmed. So there must be someone who programmed our genetic code. It just couldn't happen randomly. The order of the universe, it's very orderly. It's so orderly, we know the laws of nature we can depend on, so we can have a spaceship land on the moon because we're basing it on the laws of nature. We know what randomness is because we know what order is. Atheists love when you drop big names. Alexander Vilenkin, he's like a top secular cosmologist. Cosmologist is just a fancy word for someone who studies cosmology, the study of the universe, mostly the origin of the universe. And Alexander Vilenkin said, the only evidence we have is for the Big Bang. So basically, he's not saying the most evidence. He's saying the only evidence we have is that the Big Bang started the universe. So there's been a beginning. So if there's a beginning, cause and effect, there had to be something or someone, an intelligent force, which we call God, to start that process of the beginning. So it takes more faith to be an atheist than to be a believer there is a God. And then they always throw out that, well, if God is good and he can do anything, why is there evil? And I simply just say free will. He's given us free will. What you might think is acceptable, I might think is very evil. And what I might think is acceptable, someone else might think is very evil. But to God, God is perfect, holy, all good. So for him to get rid of all evil, he'd have to destroy all of us. We'd all be gone. So what did he do? He reached out to us and sent his only son to die for us. What more could he do to save us but to die for us? And that's what he did. So that's how I would, I would argue that. There's, C.S. Lewis was a brilliant atheist, equivalent to Richard Dawkins of our day. And when he converted, he said it was because he always thought there couldn't be a God because there's so much injustice and so much evil. And then it occurred to him, he wouldn't even know what evil and injustice was unless there was a standard of justice and good. And he said that must be God. Or as Frank Turek, another apologist, says, you can't have a shadow without the light. You can't have shadows without sunshine. You can have sunshine and light without shadows, but you can't have shadows. So we wouldn't know what evil was unless there was good. And God is good. So to me, it's illogical not to believe in God. So once you get them to believe in God, you need to take them right to the Catholic faith. Historically, you can prove, now these guys are unbelievers, so they don't have all the bias and the Protestant tradition. So you can bring them right to history. Jesus Christ was the only person that ever lived to claim to be God. Buddha, Muhammad, all these other people never claimed to be God. They claimed they would show you the way to nirvana or show you the way to God, but only Jesus Christ said, I am. Jesus Christ claimed to be God. And as C.S. Lewis said, every historian that's worth his salt, any historian with a PhD, will admit Jesus existed. The unbelieving PhDs will say, well, he was just a good man, he was just a good teacher. But C.S. Lewis said, for him to say he was God proves that either he was a liar, a lunatic, or Lord. And when you study the life of Christ, you will come to find he is Lord. He is Lord. And like I said, there's no historian that would deny that Jesus existed, just like there's no historian deny that the New Testament historical documents are the most reliable historical documents we have. The historians that are unbelievers just presuppose that miracles can't happen, so they say, well, the miracles were added to these historical documents, but everything else is true, the time, the place, the names. So we have the historical evidence to show your unbelieving friend, spouse, or whatever, that Christianity is true. But there was only one church. There was only one church. And St. Ignatius of Antioch, who was discipled by the apostles, or friends of all the apostles, said, where Jesus Christ is, there is the Catholic Church. And Antioch is the place in the Bible where they said they were first called Christians. So St. Ignatius was a bishop from Antioch, so he knew that they were called Christians, but he specifically called the church Catholic, like Catholic being its first name, Christian being its last name. We're Catholic Christians because the Catholic Church, the true church that Jesus established, believed in the incarnation, that Jesus, that God came and became fully man, flesh and blood. And there were a lot of cults saying, no, he was spiritual, he wasn't flesh and blood, and that was considered a heresy. And because they didn't believe Jesus was flesh and blood, they didn't believe Jesus when he said, this is my body, this is my blood. So they don't believe the Eucharist truly turns into the body and blood of Christ. So the early Catholic Church, the early Christian Church, St. Ignatius of Antioch specifically said, whoever doesn't believe that the bread becomes the flesh and the wine becomes the blood of God is a heretic. So that's why they call themselves Catholic Christians. And Catholic meant universal as well. That Christians that believed this, no matter what race or region of the world they were from, they believed this, they were Catholic Christians. There was unity. And for our Bible alone, Christians, there was no edited Bible at this point for 400 years. These Christians were underground getting martyred for the faith. They didn't have time to edit the letters they were getting from the apostles that were circulating to show which ones were true and which ones were not. There were many that thought the letters from St. Clement from the first century were biblical. They should be put in the Bible. But the Catholic Church alone decided in the 4th and 5th century which books would go into the Bible. So if you don't trust the Catholic Church, then you can't trust the Bible, plain and simple. So it would be easy to bring an atheist who converted to Christianity to Catholic Christianity. Now, getting specific with wives and husbands. I was reading about George Washington. I love history, and I'm reading some stuff about George Washington, and it was a quote I'd never seen before, so I shared it with my wife, and I said, here's the quote. Unless someone pops in unexpectedly, Mrs. Washington and myself will do what I believe has not been done within the last 20 years. That is to sit down to dinner by ourselves. And I said to my wife, I said, wow, we should really be thankful for George Washington saving this republic. I said, we think about all his sacrifices physically he did, but, he really sacrificed time away from his wife for 20 years. And my wife said, I think his wife sacrificed more. And I'm like, yeah, I guess she did. That old saying, behind every great man, there's a great woman, is true. So if you're a woman and you have an unbelieving husband, what's the best technique to win them? Well, I'm going to go to the greatest evangelist of all time, in my personal opinion, St. Peter. So if you look to 1 Peter chapter 3, 1 through 7. He gives advice. Likewise, you wives, be submissive to your husbands, so that some, though they do not obey the word, may be won without a word by the behavior of their wives. So we're going to get to that submissive part. It's a little controversial, but I'm going to have to show you some other scriptures to really show you what St. Peter's talking about. But he's definitely saying your behavior is going to win your husband to Christ. When they see your reverent and chaste behavior, let not yours be the outward adorning of braiding of hair, decoration of gold, and wearing of robes. It's like saying, don't focus on the outside, makeup, trying to look all sexy and beautiful. No, let it be the hidden person of the heart. That's what's going to win your husband, your heart. With the imperishable jewel of a gentle and quiet spirit, which in God's sight is very precious. So once the holy women who hoped in God used to adorn themselves and were submissive to their husbands, as Sarah obeyed Abraham, calling him Lord. And you are now her children if you do right, and not let nothing terrify you. Say, don't be scared. I'm not talking about submission to a mean, abusive husband. I'm talking about godly submission, respect, reverence, supporting. Likewise, you husbands. So we're going to go now how a husband, but we're going to go back to husbands. We're going to go back and forth with husbands and wives. Likewise, you husbands, live considerately with your wives, bestowing honor on the woman as the weaker sex. And that word weaker, those words weaker sex is talking physically. I mean, unless you spent 4 years in Harvard University, you know that men are generally speaking, physically stronger than women. We're equal mentally, we're equal spiritually before God, but physically, we're stronger. So don't abuse that. Don't use that strength and lord over them like these pagans were doing in those days. Since you are joint heirs of the grace of life. Now, this is revolutionary. He's saying you guys are joint. You guys are equal to the grace of God. In order that your prayers may not be hindered. Husbands, did you hear that? Bestow honor on the woman. And then we'll skip down, everything I said, but why? In order that your prayers may not be hindered. So if you're dishonoring, if you're disrespecting your wife, that's why your prayers aren't being answered, bro. Think about that. That's huge. So if you're praying for your wife to get saved, if you're praying for your wife to become a believer, if you're praying for your wife to get close to God, and it's not working, look in the mirror. Are you honoring your wife? Are you respecting your wife? Because if not, your prayers will be hindered. And St. Paul touches on this subject in Ephesians chapter 5, verses 21 to 33. Now, St. Peter said, wives, submit to your husbands. And a lot of people are like, wow, that's like old-fashioned. But what did he mean by that? Well, Paul tells the church, and I'm sure Peter was assuming the church understood this, be subject to one another. Or it could be translated, submit to one another. So you're both submitting to each other. So it's not just wives submit to your husband, it's submit to one another out of reverence for Christ. Wives, be subject to your husbands, or some translations say submit, as to the Lord. For the husband is the head of the wife, as Christ is the head of the church, his body, and himself its Savior. The church is subject to Christ, so let wives be subject in everything to their husbands. So he is saying that there's a hierarchy in the family, just like there is in the church, just like there isn't anywhere, and the husband is the head. Doesn't mean he's better. Doesn't mean that he should lord over the wife. It's just he's given the responsibility to be the head of that family. So what's his responsibility as the head of the family? Husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her. So you got to be willing to die for your wife like Jesus died for us. And in Afghanistan, there's men that are going to be asked to do that today as I speak. In America and most of Europe, we're not called to do that. But we're called to die to ourselves. And how does that play out in real life? Well, it might mean sacrificing going to play golf because your wife needs you at home to help her. It might mean sacrifice watching a fight because your wife wants to spend time talking with you. You know, I know it means that even if, circumstances, your wife has to work, you're the one responsibility to bring the food in the house. You're the one, ultimately. That's very clear in the scriptures from the beginning. God told Adam that he was cursed to work the rest of his life, and Eve's curse was he would have pain during childbearing. So as men, we are called to be the breadwinner. We are called, if you got to work 90 hours a week, that's your calling from God. You got to provide for your wife. Now, if your wife and you come to a decision that she wants to go out and work, that's fine. But at the end of the day, husbands are responsible to provide. Unless, they're ill, and I know, and I'm not trying to be harsh, I'm talking about healthy men. I'm not talking about men that have sickness and disease or disabilities. Please, don't misunderstand me. And I don't want you to feel bad. I had one guy write me and said he felt bad because I said something like this. I don't mean that at all. That's something totally different. I'm saying in general, we're called to be the leaders of the house. And that's not bossing people around. That's leading them out of love. And then what happens? If we're willing to die for our wives, go to verse 26. That he might sanctify her, having cleansed her by the washing of water with the word, that he might present. So husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her, that he might sanctify her, having cleansed her by the washing of water with the word, that he might present the church to himself in splendor, without spot or wrinkle or any such thing, that she might be holy and without blemish. So he's comparing how he died for the church and is presenting us to God, to husbands. Even so, husbands, love their wives as their own bodies. He who loves his wife loves himself. For no man ever hates his own flesh, but nourishes and cherishes it, as Christ does his church, because we are members of his body. For this reason a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. This is a great mystery, and I mean in reference to Christ and the church. However, let each of you love his wife as himself, and let the wife see that she respects her husbands. So if you want to bring your wife to Christ, love her the way Christ loved the church. And he presents us to the Father, and we present her to the Father. And then wives, respect. That was the final word. He said, respect your husbands. So we're not talking about an ungodly, abusive demand that you submit to me. We're talking about a mutual submission to one another's needs, a mutual submission to one another's insecurities, loving each other. But the husband is given the responsibility to die. Nowhere in the scriptures does it say, wives, die for your husband. So don't get a big head that you're the leader. You're the leader because you're the one that's got to take the bullet if it comes down to it. And then with children, there's some advice to fathers. If you go down to 6:4, fathers, do not provoke your children to anger, but bring them up in the discipline and instructions of the Lord. So you don't want to frustrate your kid. You don't want to be the one of the dads always criticizing your kid, always on your kid's back. The Bible tells us not to do that. Don't provoke your kids to anger. We got to discipline them, but discipline is training out of love. The Old Testament tells us, train up a child in the way he should go, in the end he won't depart. It also tells us to teach, in the Old Testament, it tells us to teach our kids about God and what he's done for us. When they wake up, when you're walking by a park, when you're putting them to bed, basically always be talking to your kids about God. Share with them experiences. I share with my kids all the time How there were times I didn't know how I was going to pay the bills and God miraculously provided. How times me and my wife didn't think we were going to make it and God miraculously healed our marriage. Let your kids know God is real. And even if they walk away, the Bible tells us in the end they'll come back to the truth because they'll see all that other stuff is not real. I know pastors whose kids have left the faith and came back. Billy Graham's son, Franklin Graham's a great example because they knew what was true. So they went out to see what they thought was true, and then they realized this is all false, and they come back. So that's how you win your children. So I hope this was helpful, and there was so much more I want to say that I left out, but hopefully this is what God wanted you to hear today. But no matter where you're at with your relationship with God and your spouse and your children, just trust God and know the Bible promises us love never fails. So just love, 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 and trust God. Stay Catholic, and do me a favor, please. If you want to support this ministry, if you're buying or selling real estate, go to realestateforlife.org. Tell them Blue Collar Catholic sent you. If you need a mover, if you need a real estate attorney, anything moving related, ask them. There's really great guys over there that'll help you along, and they're all pro-life Christians. So God bless and stay Catholic.